everyone, welcome back to my channel. As you may have noticed, I did not post at all last year. I had some very big life changes in my life at the end of 2023. I'm not really up for talking about it. If you know me personally, you may know what they are, and you can also look on my YouTube. I did share a video about it. But I'm trying to get back into posting more. I do enjoy posting about books I enjoy reading, and this is a place where I can do that. So I'm going to try and be somewhat consistent about posting to YouTube this year. I'm just not sure how much I'm going to post. I also want to change the format of the way I talk about my books, because in the past I've done like one whole video at a time and I filmed it all together, and that just didn't work for me that well because I found I was really forgetting what I was talking about in the books. So I'm gonna try the format that Chantel Reads All Day uses. She reads some books and then talks about it, so she has a few different segments, I guess. Not segments, but she talks about her books as she finishes them instead of saving them all until the end. The first book I read this year was The Kindest Lie by Nancy Johnson, and I read that for the reading challenge that Kayla over at Books and Lala is doing. I don't remember what it's called, but it's about this girl named Ruth, and she is currently 28. She's living in Chicago with her husband, and they've been married for about 4 years, and her husband is ready to start having kids. But Ruth is really unsure because 11 years ago, when Ruth was 17, she ended up having a baby the summer after she graduated high school. And she was living with her grandmother at the time, who she also calls Mom. And her grandmother really encouraged her to put that baby up for adoption, which she did. But it really wasn't her choice in the matter. So now Ruth is struggling with all these thoughts because she doesn't know her baby and she wants to find out who her kid is after 11 years. And so what she does is she decides to go home to Indiana for Christmas in order to get some information from her grandmother about the baby. And her grandmother is very unwilling to give her information. So we go on this journey with Ruth as she gets the information, and we kind of learn that her grandmother just wanted her to have a better life, because the place where she grew up, if you don't create a better life for yourself, you're kind of just stuck there. And now Ruth is this engineer. It's also important to say that this is a Black community that Ruth is living in, so she's Black, and so there's all these stereotypes with the people that live there. And so Ruth goes back home to Indiana, and she decides to stop by a store where her and her grandmother used to shop all the time, and her grandmother has a really good friend that runs the store. And Ruth is looking for this friend, and she's not there, but she runs into a boy named Midnight, and that starts an unusual friendship between the two of them. And Midnight would be about the same age that Ruth's son would be. I listened to this on audio, and so when I was listening to it, I found that I wasn't sure why the author was adding in all of the details that she needed to, but once I finished the story, I could understand why she added in the details. I enjoyed the book. While I was reading, I just thought some things weren't needed. I'm also listening to The Letter Tree by Rachel Fordham. I'm only 4 chapters in. I just started this last night, and The Letter Tree is about this girl named Laura, and 7 years ago, her mom passed away, and so that has really shaped her life growing up. And 7 years ago, she also had a crush on a boy named Isaac. And Isaac is 2 years older than her. So then we fast forward to 7 years later, but 7 years ago, Laura started writing poems, and she went to the zoo and put a poem in a tree. And she wasn't ever expecting anybody to find it, I don't think. And then Isaac, 7 years ago, found this poem in the tree and started writing back to Laura. But the thing is, Laura and Isaac don't know that they're writing to each other because they're keeping their names anonymous. So now I think Laura is 21 and Isaac is 23, and all these years they're still continuing to write to each other. They still have no idea who each other is, like who the anonymous people are. They know who they are in the world, but they really have no connection. Laura is getting to the age where her father thinks it's time for her to be married. So Laura's father invites this person over for dinner. I don't remember his last name, but Ruth thought he was going to be some really old person. But his name is Abel, and he's in his late 20s, I think. And they have dinner together, and her father and Abel are in the same business, and so her father wants Laura's father wants Laura to marry Abel because it would be a good business decision. And Laura is really unsure about her decision of wanting to marry Abel. And Laura's father tells her that her mother was a good actor, and Laura really has no idea what that means. And so Laura's trying to find the way of like, should I go this way in my life or should I go this way in my life? And so she's really trying to figure that out. So she writes a letter to Isaac. She still doesn't know who he is, that they should stop writing letters to each other because her father wants her to marry this guy. And Isaac is completely heartbroken when he reads this letter because this letter has become this constant thing in his life, and he really depends on these letters because they make his day feel better. And so Isaac, but I have to backtrack. A few, I guess, days before, Isaac saw Ruth walking in the street, and he went to go wave at her, but he didn't because the Bradshaw Shoe Company, after Ruth's mom died, it split into two, and so now Ruth's father and Isaac's father, I think, are like rivals in business. So even if Isaac would want to date even if Isaac would want to date Laura, it wouldn't be allowed just because their parents are rivals. So Isaac writes this letter back to Laura, and he tells her that on Friday he'd like to meet at this specific place at this specific time, and he leaves it in the tree hoping that Laura will see this letter and it won't be too late. And that's all I've read in this book so far, and like I said, I'm only 4 chapters in, but so far I'm really enjoying it. So it's currently January 8th, 2 days after I last gave you an update on the letter tree. So I left off at the end of chapter 4. So Laura's housekeeper, Mrs. Bunskin, I think her name is, ends up going to the tree and finds the letter and gives it to Laura. And so Laura goes to the place where Isaac suggested. And Isaac is basically hiding away because he doesn't know who this person is, and so he wants to know who this person is first. And so when he sees it's Laura, he realizes that he would never be able to have a relationship with her because of the feud that their 2 fathers are in. So he waits there for 2 hours until Laura leaves, and so Laura eventually leaves, and she writes Isaac a note. And so Laura doesn't know who Isaac is, but now Isaac knows that Laura is the letter writer. And so Laura was like, I came, but I'll just believe that it was too hard for you to say goodbye. So the rest of the book is like Isaac trying to realize that he wants this relationship with Laura, but he's unable to have it because of the feud. And Laura feels similar about Isaac, even though she doesn't know he is the other person writing the letters. And so what Isaac tries to do is he tries to figure out the reason behind this feud to maybe put an end to it. And so I just finished the end of chapter 24, and I just want to share some thoughts, and I'm not sure if I'm going to share any spoilers, but if you don't want to hear any possible spoilers, feel free to skip this part. So Laura has this boyfriend Abel, who I previously talked about, and they're in some kind of relationship. He hasn't really decided or made it official yet, and Isaac was in a relationship with a girl named Ruth, and Isaac had such strong feelings for Laura that he decided to call it off with Ruth, and Laura eventually finds out that Isaac is the letter writer, but she still continues to stay with Abel because it makes her father happy. She doesn't want to, and Laura and Isaac eventually end up telling each other that they know that they're the letter writers, and so they're now committed to each other, but Laura still has Abel on the side. So I really love Rachel Fordham's writing. I think she's a great writer, great author. I really love this relationship between Laura and Isaac. I just have that problem with Laura still having Abel on the side. I understand the premise of the story, but I don't necessarily agree with it. And like I said, I've only just finished chapter 24 and I still have 10 or 11 chapters left. So I'm interested to see how the rest of the story is going to play out. I finished The Letter Tree by Rachel Fordham, and overall I really enjoyed the story. I just wasn't a big fan of Laura and Abel's storyline. I really loved Laura and Isaac's storyline and their relationship and how all of that played out. I really loved the themes in the story of forgiveness and renewed relationships. It was really amazing to see all of that. I just wish there would have been more of a faith content in this book. I know Rachel Fordham is a Christian author, and I was just a little disappointed to see that there wasn't really any faith content in this book. I think it would have made it a lot stronger, and I read this book for the Read Your Bookshelf Challenge at Chantel Reads All Day. The prompt for January was beauty, and I think Rachel Fordham just has some amazing, beautiful book covers, so that was the reason I went with this book. I am also reading How to Be a Tudor by Ruth Goodman. I read How to Be a Victorian England or something a few years ago, and it's just basically taking you through a day in the life of someone who lives in Tudor England. And so far I've read about the morning process of like the kind of beds you sleep in and like the kind of mattresses you have and how that's set up for families and all that kind of stuff. And it was just really interesting because one of the things it said was that curtains aren't for windows, they're for beds. So it's a good thing if you have like a curtain bed with curtains around it. And it was really interesting because it also talked about how in Shakespeare's will, he left his married daughter his best bed, but to his wife he gave his second best bed. So people kind of think that's not really a good thing. But when Ruth Goodman was doing her research on this, she came to the conclusion that it still was a good thing because he made sure she still had a good bed and was warm and all of those things that were needed back in those time periods. And then I've also read the second chapter, which is about how you keep yourself clean and your clothing and your washing, and so all of that has been really interesting. And it's also been interesting reading about how Ruth Goodman has also put some of these into practice for her research in this book, and hearing other people compared to what she has done and how it's produced different results. So that's also been really interesting. Also, I'm reading this book for the Read in the New Year reading challenge hosted by Oshina at Oshina Gotta Read 'Em All, and that one was the prompt to read something you want to learn more about. So I just thought I would read this because it seemed interesting. And then for that challenge, I'm also reading The Giver by Lois Lowry, and the prompt for this one is to declutter, which is read a book from your bookshelves. And I have had this on my shelf for at least 2 years. I wanted to read it at the end of 2023, but then I didn't get around to it. And recently I walked into a group of people reading this, and I had to read 2 chapters. And at the end of each chapter, they were just blown away by amazement over what had happened. And I was like, I have no idea what's going on. This makes no sense. But it just seemed super interesting. And so I knew it was one I wanted to pick up soon. And I'm so glad I started reading it. And so it's about this boy named Jonas. And he is in this family unit with his parents. And he has a sister. Jonas is in his 11th year. And Lily is in her 7th year. And when you get to your 12th year, which is basically like age 12, there is a ceremony, and you are basically given a career of what you are going to do with your life. And when you're in your 11th year, there's lots of scouts that come and follow you and see what your interests are, and so they follow you like with your volunteer hours, your recreational hours, and other things. And so Jonas is a little apprehensive about what he is going to get because he has never really focused on one thing. He's kind of just done them all. So he's sharing this at supper with his family when they do their daily thing of telling each other how they feel. And so then his parents talked to him about it, and his dad was like, well, I wasn't really surprised at what I was going to end up with because I spent a lot of time with the babies, so they gave me the role of nurturer. And so Jonas's dad is then telling them about what happened at his workplace, and there's this baby who is possibly going to get released, and that's a really sad thing. And I'm not sure what release means yet, and I'm not sure if the characters actually know what release means yet. It's a celebration when an older person gets released because they've lived a long, full life, but not when a baby gets released. So Jonas's dad has an idea to bring this kid home and hoping to bond with him so that he won't get released, but they are unable to keep him because in this world, the family unit can only be 2 parents, 1 boy and 1 girl. And so this kid is a boy and you can't have more than 2 kids. And so his father eventually brings him home. The baby's name is Gabe or Gabriel, and you're not allowed to use his name technically until this ceremony of where they place the year ones with their family unit. And his dad sneaked into Jonas's dad sneaked into the office to find out what number 36's name would be. And so that's against the rules. And Jonas was a little apprehensive about hearing that because his mom disciplines people who have rules, but his mom really didn't seem to matter in this. And I've only read about 4 or 5 chapters, so I haven't gotten very far. So as I find out more, I will keep you updated on my thoughts and what else happens in the story. But so far, I'm just finding it really interesting, and I'm really engaged, and I just want to keep reading. Today is January 15th. And I recently finished The Giver a couple days ago, and I left off that Jonas had not been given his assignment. I called it a career, but it's actually an assignment. He hadn't been given that yet. So at this ceremony, he is given his assignment, and it's not really an assignment, or he hasn't been assigned anything. He's more been selected, and he's been selected to be the receiver of memory. And there is only one in their whole community. And basically what this receiver of memory is they have all the memories of the positive and negative things in all of life, because their community is basically just sameness. So everything's the same. Nobody really knows what pain is except for Jonas and the person who will be giving him all of these memories from decades and decades ago. And so we go through the book as Jonas the receiver, and the other receiver, who is now called the giver, is giving these memories to Jonas and what they decide to do about it. I really enjoyed this book. I also watched the movie yesterday. I thought it would maybe help me understand a little bit more of the story and what it was going on, but I found the movie went really, really quick, because within like the first 10 minutes of the movie, they had already announced that Jonas was the receiver. And I'm solely listening to audiobooks right now, and it took me about an hour and a half to 2 hours to get in to that Jonas was actually given the receiver, which was about 20% of the book, and this movie was an hour and a half. So I just felt it moved along a little too quickly. There were a few things that helped me understand it better, and I would like to continue with this series. There are just some other books I want to finish first before I do continue with the rest of the series. I have also continued with How to Be a Tudor, and that's still been really interesting. I've read about clothing and how you were respected based on the type of clothing that you wore, and sometimes if people didn't feel they get the respect that they deserved, then they'd kill the person. And then they also talked a lot about posture, whether it was proper for you to stand behind with your hands behind your back, depending on what kind of person you were, or with your hands by your side or on your hips or whatever. That was really interesting. They also talked a lot about, not a lot, but about breakfast and what breakfast really meant. That chapter was only about 5 minutes. All the other chapters are about an hour to an hour and a half. I'm listening to the audiobooks at a speed less than 1, so it would be quicker if you listen to it at 1 speed or 2 times speed. I just need to listen to it a bit slower, and so it's taking me a bit longer to listen to it. Not that I'm complaining, it's just the chapters are really long. And then the most recent one was about dinner, and that talked a lot about wheat and farming, and so that's been really interesting. I have a few more chapters left, so I've not finished that. And then I've also just started The Lion Women of Tehran, and that's by Marjan Tumal, I think her name is, and that is also, I'm reading for the read in the new year, and that prompt is travel, and it's to read a book in a country that's not your own. And so that book is set in Iran, and the first chapter starts out with Ellie. She's now an adult, I think 30 years later, and so she gets this letter. I think she's living in America, from her mom, and she also gets a letter from this girl named Tama, and her friend is asking her to call her, and she has no idea why. She hasn't heard from this friend in years, so she doesn't know if she really wants to call this friend. But when Ellie was 7, her dad died, and her mom didn't have enough money to continue living in the fancy house that they were living in. So her uncle, which was her father's brother, decided to pay the rent for a different house for her and her mother to live in. Her mother doesn't like the house that they're living in, because she says that the house is in the slums and they are living with people that are below them, because her mother is saying she came from royalty and these people basically don't have a lot. And so Ellie ends up going to this neighborhood school. Her mother doesn't like it, and Ellie is really desperate to make friends, but she doesn't want to be friends with anybody there. After a few weeks, a girl named Homa just asks Ellie if she would come over to play, and Ellie doesn't really want to have anything to do with Homa, but because she wants a friend, she's willing to go over. And then she ends up being really good friends with Homa, but her mother doesn't want her hanging out with anybody in the neighborhood because of it not being a good place of like not rich people. And so Ellie's mother is just really upset about her being friends with Homa, and 3 years go by and they're still living in this area, and Homa and Ellie are still friends, and Ellie's mother is starting to get really annoyed with Ellie, and Ellie doesn't know why. She just loves her life there, but like I said, Ellie's mom thinks that this life is below them. And so Ellie's mom makes a plan to move her and Ellie into a different house in a better part of town, even though Ellie doesn't want to. And that's all I've read so far. And so I'm really enjoying it so far, and I'm looking forward to reading the rest of the story. Today is January 19th, and I have now finished both books, How to Be a Tudor and The Lion Women of Tehran. With How to Be a Tudor, the other things that I found interesting in there was that unmarried women and wives were under the authority of their husbands and fathers, and that if you were in that category, you weren't allowed to have a business, or you weren't allowed to run a business. But if you were a widow, you were allowed to run a business. And from that, then the women who were widows could then employ the single or married ladies, and normally the men who owned businesses wouldn't do that. And so now what this did, specifically for single ladies, but it could also do for married ladies, was that then these women would have skills with them to take into their marriage, and sometimes the men would choose a woman based off of the skills she had that would benefit him and the family and what he was working on. So I found that quite interesting, and that was in women's work. It also talked about men's work. Then it also talked about like recreational time, and then it talked about dinner. And some things I found interesting from there was that the order that you ate your food was based on how it best digested in your stomach. And they also had communal drinking cups at dinner time, which meant, like, you know how we have like a cup for each person with the plate. They only had one, and so it was really interesting reading about that. And then the last chapter was what you do when you go to bed and all of that stuff, and I found the entire book really interesting and informative. And with The Lion Women of Tehran, I left off that Ellie's mother had this plan to move her away from the slums of the place that she was living in, and she also wanted to move her away from Homa. So now Ellie and her mom are no longer living near Homa. They're no longer living in the slums. She hasn't really stayed in contact with Homa, but later in their life, like in her teenage years, like later teenage years, Homa finds a way to come back into Ellie's life again, and now they are reconnected. And what is happening in Iran at this time, this is like 1950s, 1960s. What's happening in Iran is that there's a lot of political tension going on. And so one of them is very much fighting for communism on the communist side, and the other one is just trying to like be neutral and not voice her opinions about what's happening in Iran. And what happens because of these political views is that one of them ends up betraying the other one, and what happens is this betrayal alters the course of both of their lives, and we go through the rest of the story reading basically the outcomes of what has happened because of that. And it was just such a powerful story. I loved it so much, and Marjan Kumali just has such this beautiful way of writing, and the story writing was just so beautiful. I highly recommend this book. Today is January 26th, and I finished reading The Good Sister by Sally Hepworth. I didn't really know much about it going in. I know that lots of the people I follow on BookTube have really loved it. I kind of thought it was a murder mystery, but it turns out it's nothing like that. So it's about these two sisters named Rose and Fern, and Fern thrives very much on consistency. She has to keep her schedule the same every single week. She goes over to Rose's house 3 nights a week for supper, and she also has sensory processing disorder, so there's things that are a bit more complicated for her to do. She also has a job at the library that she loves to do. She kind of considers the library like her home. And Rose and Fern had a very hard life growing up, and so they went to the library a lot. So I think that's why Fern finds a lot of solace in the library. And so one night that Fern is over at Rose's, she finds these pills that Rose takes because Rose can't have kids. And so Fern discovers this, and in Fern's mind, she's like, I can give Rose a baby. But Fern doesn't have a boyfriend or anybody in her life, so she has to find now this man to get her pregnant so that she can give this baby to Rose. How this book is set up is there are journal entries that we read from Rose, and then we follow Fern and her life and her time at the library and her time with Rose and their sister bond and just this new relationship that Fern enters and everything that happens because of that. And I absolutely loved this book. There were so many things that I didn't see coming that just made it like a jaw-dropping, enjoyable read. And it's probably my favorite read of January. And I also just started last night Expiration Dates by Rebecca Searle, and that book is about this girl. I don't remember what her name is, but she receives these letters or papers with the person who she's going on a date with, their name, and how long she's going to be in a relationship with it for. Sometimes it's only 2 hours, sometimes it's 8 days, but this time, this person that she goes on a date with, it's just the name, and there's no time on it. So she thinks she met her soulmate, and that's basically as far into the book as I've got so far, and I'm really interested how this is going to compare to Instructions for Dancing by Nicola Yoon, because that book is about this girl named Evie, and every time she sees a couple kiss, she sees the beginning, middle, and ending of their relationship. And then when Evie finds this boy she likes and they get in a relationship and they kiss, then Evie sees the ending of their relationship. So she has to figure out whether this relationship is worth having. So I'm really looking forward to reading the rest of Expiration Dates. And today is January 31st, and yesterday I finished Expiration Dates, and it basically follows Daphne and Jake's relationship in the present, and Daphne continues to go on all these dates with Jake because she truly believes that he is her soulmate because that piece of paper was empty with only his name on it. We also follow a lot of Destiny talking about her and Jake with this guy named Hugo. And Hugo was another one of Daphne's boyfriends, but they ended up breaking up, and I'm not going to say why because that would be a spoiler, but they've still remained really good friends to this day. We also follow in the book lots of Daphne's other relationships and those adventures and the piece of paper and how long all of those relationships are. I really enjoyed this book, and I said I was looking forward to seeing how it compared to Instructions for Dancing, and I would say it was really similar. I still prefer Instructions for Dancing, but I still highly recommend Expiration Dates. Daphne had basically all of these timelines planned out, and so it really does relate to Instructions for Dancing by like, does she really want this, or is just the piece of paper deciding it for her? And those were all the 7 books I read in January. I would love to hear some of the books that you read in January, so feel free to comment some of those down below. Thanks for watching.